This is our spring quarter DRMA lecture. It was originally scheduled in the winter, but we had this polar vortex, so we had to call off the event the day before. But we're fortunate to have Dr. O'Donnell with us today to talk about Elizabeth Ann Seton and her book. So this is Elizabeth Seton, an American saint. I don't have copies of this, but I know where to get them. So it's really a wonderful biography and important in so many ways for our work here at DePaul. So Sister Betty Ann McNeil is going to introduce Dr. O'Donnell. Just a couple of logistical things. We still have plenty of food left over in the room adjacent to us, so please help yourself. The bathrooms are kitty corner all the way across the library. So the format for this, we usually have lunch, a rolling lunch, and then Dr. O'Donnell will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for some Q&A afterward. So it's a great privilege to have Dr. O'Donnell, and this is really an important contribution to our understanding of the lives of one of the founders in the Ascension family, Elizabeth Ann Seton. So with that, Sister Betty Ann.
Thank you. It's indeed a pleasure and a privilege to have Dr. Catherine O'Donnell with us in Chicago as the published author of the most recent scholarly biography of Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton. In fact, the first scholarly biography that has been done since 1950, when Dr. Annabelle Melville did her work. Dr. O'Donnell is a wife, mother, teacher, has really come to know Elizabeth Seton from the inside out. I think maybe the only difference is she wasn't born in New York or spent time in Livorno in the way that Elizabeth Seton did. Dr. O'Donnell comes to us from Arizona State University, where she is currently Associate Professor of History. She has additional publications in addition to the Seton work, a narrative history of the Jesuits in the United States, and men of letters in the early republic, cultivating forms of citizenship. We might like to add that to our reading list these days. Dr. O'Donnell has given extensive lectures around the country throughout the Seton and Vincentian universities and contributed widely to scholarly publications. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Catherine O'Donnell to tell us more about Elizabeth Seton, an American saint, and a Vincentian woman. Dr. O'Donnell.
Thank you, sister. Without whom the book would never have been written. That is the literal truth. So thank you so much for having me. The invitation to participate in this particular lecture series left me thinking about the Vincentian ethos of love in action, a spirituality that I understand is rooted in both prayer and in practical work, and that makes love not only an emotion but a call to duty. So I thought that I would think out loud about Mother Seton in that context. And I should emphasize, I'm an historian, a humble historian. I'm not a theologian, and I'm not a member of a religious community. So I'll be talking to you about the things I learned the way historians learn things, which is in archives. Reading letters, some of them with frayed edges, or words that you realized were broken when the seal was broken, right, 200 years ago. Things that you learn from reading journals, which, like every journal I've ever created, stops and starts at random moments, completely immune to my pleas of what happened, just kind of stops. And from looking at, and these were some of my favorites in Mother Seton's archive, little tiny slips of paper with notes that have no addresses written on them, just nicknames, and they're about this big. So that's the way I learn things, right? That's the labor of the historian. And it means that there's always something more to be learned, right? Always something more to be thought about. So I've tried to leave even, I think, extra time for questions, because people always think of things I haven't thought of, and my own work builds so clearly on the work of Sisters and Daughters of Charity, Annabelle Melville, and other people. But I do think maybe that piecing together these letters and journals is a little bit of the way historians work to bring love into the world, right? The way that we begin to understand how people thought and felt in the past and why they did the things that they did, so that we can kind of expand our modern circle of compassion and understanding a little bit. And again, it really is because of the Institute here, DePaul, scholars in the Vincentian tradition that I was able to have so much fun for so many years with Elizabeth Seton's documents. So really being here today with you in this setting just means the world to me. So what I'm going to do today is tell you a story, because this is the awesome thing about being an historian, is that we're basically professional storytellers. And I know that a lot of people here know quite a bit about Mother Seton, and so I won't rehearse every element, although every element is really interesting, trust me. Instead, I'll highlight, I'll give you kind of the structure, and then I'll highlight some moments where I think it is possible to see Elizabeth Seton creating this life of love in action. And then I'll also think about some ways in which creating that life did require struggle. Sometimes struggle against the world, and she was good with that. She had no problem working against the conventions of the world. But sometimes struggle, I think, against parts of her own nature. And that can be more challenging. At least that's my sense of things. So Elizabeth Seton's life was short, 46 years long. Seems short to me, not to these young people in the front row. But it was filled with drama and with risk and with a quiet fearlessness, really. She was born Elizabeth Bailey to an Episcopalian, but not very Episcopalian, family, just as the American Revolution sort of edged toward the colonies. And her family, by the way, called her Betsy. So she was Betsy for her first years. And New York then was barely a town. It extended about a half-mile north of what is now the Battery. Her father went hunting on Staten Island, and her half-brothers fished in the Hudson, which I suspect one should not do. And so Betsy was a child during the British occupation of the city and the area, and her family suffered. Everyone suffered, right? War brought fear and disease and dispossession. And by the time independence was won, Manhattanites, some of them were living in shacks that they had pieced together from ship's canvases and spars. Elizabeth's family had an additional problem. They had been not patriots, but loyalists. They'd chosen the wrong side, or at least the different side. And they had to overcome the mistrust of the victors, right, as after any war. But there was also a far deeper pain for young Betsy. When she was only about 3, her mother died, and a baby sister died not long after that. And Elizabeth and her older sister gained a stepmother when their father, a really ambitious, interesting physician named Richard Bailey, remarried. But this stepmother, Charlotte, was young and awkward. Her own parents had died when she was very young, and she really, it's clear, had trouble mothering these girls. And in fact, had difficulties, I think it's fair to say, with her own children also, as time went on. And as Elizabeth or Betsy grew up, they were often sent to stay with an aunt and uncle in Westchester. And they were kind, but you can tell that for Elizabeth, home was where her father was. And that was true even though she knew she wasn't quite wanted in her stepmother and father's home. And she was often unhappy. Melancholy is a sort of 18th century language, right? We would just say sad or even depressed, not in a technical sense. And in a way that I think most of us can sympathize with, she was unhappy with herself for being unhappy. She wanted to be more cheerful. She wanted to be good. One night, she even imagined drinking laudanum, which was an opiate then used by physicians like her father, so it would have been in the house, to treat ailments. And had she drunk enough, she would have ended her life in that moment. She frightened herself with that thought, and she was grateful to God that she didn't act on it. And sometimes when people hear of this, they sort of rush to reassure me. It was just a passing fancy. And they're not wrong, it was a passing thought, but it's also the case that she never forgot it, right? And in fact, when you look in the archive, which you all will because I'm going to force you to know, when you look in the archive and you see this commonplace book where she wrote out poetry that meant a lot to her, there's a very sad poem and there's a discoloration, which she later circled and wrote, "Tears, the night of the little bottle." So the discoloration are tears, the little bottle is the laudanum. And she never forgot what it was like to think even for a moment that the world was better off without her, or that she had no home at all. And she never forgot what it was like to be an outsider, to have this dispossessed, unsettled childhood. And that sense of outsiderness, that sense of frailty, it doesn't stand in contrast to her sainthood, right? It's part of what made her the woman that she became. So this was all very grim, but then she's happy. In her late teens, we start to see clues again in the archive. So there's one little note that says, "It is my intention to pass an hour with Mrs. Wilkes in the evening, where you may have the honor of seeing me, if you please." And she's written this to a young man named William Seton. And there's another note, "Mrs. Sadler is not going to the concert and wishes very much to see us this evening. Do not be too late." That's another note. So she's very confident, kind of flirtatious. And William Seton was a tall, handsome merchant, several years older than Elizabeth. And he was cosmopolitan, he'd lived in Italy, he loved the music and art, and soon he loved Elizabeth. And he did not call her Betsy, by the way, he called her Eliza. So things were changing. And one way as an historian you realize that this is a love match is that it was completely impractical. So at that time in New York, people sort of congregated in almost informal professional villages, right? So that William Seton's father, a merchant, expected William to marry the daughter of a merchant and bring him some very nice merchant connections. Thank you, right? This is what other people in the family did. And Elizabeth Seton's sister married a physician, right? But Elizabeth didn't bring any good merchant connections. She brought William only herself. And he chose her. And Elizabeth, who we know had always sort of coveted her father's attention, right? She knew that marrying this merchant rather than a medical student or a doctor would bring her away from her father's world. And off she went. She was in love with William, and you can see there's a little note where you can just see this happening. So she's always kind of looked for her father's attention, they've read together, they've talked together, and then not long after their marriage, there's this sad little letter from Elizabeth's father, Richard Bailey. It says, why don't you don't call, you don't write. So it's the 18th century equivalent of that, and she very kindly says, no, I'm sorry, and she'll come back. But it's clear that now she has her own home, right? And it's really the first home she's truly felt, right? What was her own is the home that she made. And they were happy. Just you feel this sort of glow when you're reading the letters from this time. And William worked for his father, who was a far more assertive, kind of joyful merchant than William himself. And they lived in a snug little house on Wall Street. I always say with Hamilton down one end and Burr down the other, but that lay in the future. And they had friends in the evening, they entertained, they had music. And Elizabeth eventually bore 5 children, two boys and 3 girls. And I always say that all of them got, 3 nicknames, 4 nicknames. It's just sort of all this affection, and I would still be trying to finish this book had Sisters and Daughters of Charity not helpfully annotated who all these nicknames were, because they're really quite creative. So New York, by this time, the city had recovered from the Revolution, and it was booming. But, New York is going to be a tough place, right? And it was still a tough place. The kind of place where if firewood was expensive and you couldn't find work, you might freeze. And women were particularly vulnerable because they could not, by convention, earn money, right? In a lot of the ways that men could. And so a woman named Isabella Graham, a friend of Elizabeth, founded a poor widows society to help women and children who were struggling in that difficult economy, where there was really no safety net but human kindness, and that sometimes was in short supply. So Elizabeth worked with this society for a number of years, investing not only time but attention, compassion. And so it's a point at which we see her practicing love in the world, love at work. So these years were on the whole happy and fulfilling. They also, I think, reveal 2 things that would challenge Elizabeth throughout the rest of her life. That's what I think. We'll see if you agree with me in the question and answer. So the first was that she really liked to be alone. She treasured moments where she could read, or where she could sit and think, or pray. She absolutely adored being a mother, right? That is clear. She loved the work that she did. She loved her husband. But she felt the pull of solitude. And things were just not quite right with her if she couldn't sometimes gather herself quietly and alone. And the second challenge was that she feared that love meant loss. She lived in a time when death seized people at all ages, in all seasons. And sometimes she felt she could not bear the uncertainty. And just as one example, and there are scores, but her older son, Will, was terribly ill as a baby, just dreadfully ill. And of course, there's no antibiotics, there's no fever reducers, right? There's no IVs. In the end, Will did recover, but she wondered candidly whether the terror, and it is terror, had been worth it. What is there in the uncertainty of human happiness to repay the agonizing convulsion of those 24 hours in which I witnessed the baby suffering? And as a mother, I see some of you nodding, right? Or as a father, right? As someone who loves other people, that really just spoke to me, that kind of fear. And there was a deeper uncertainty because there is a kind of shadow that is lengthening across these very bright days. And as you sit in the archive and you read your way through this period, you can just feel the shadow creeping in. And William, her handsome young husband, is coughing. And he begins to run fevers. And you can see that no one wants to name what this is. And what it is consumption, or as we would have it, tuberculosis. It ran in his family. His mother may have died of it. His aunt, a sister, was ill. It was incurable. And it is the very essence of uncertainty. Because with tuberculosis, there are periods where people tend to get better. And you can hope that, maybe everything will be fine. And then there's almost always another decline. And people kind of waste away. So tuberculosis had just stalked the Seton family. And it's hunting William. And Elizabeth is a highly rational daughter of a physician, and she knows. She knows where this is going. She continues to take great pleasure in her family and in her husband, but that delight is just cheek by jowl with dread. So there's one afternoon where she describes how she and her husband have spent this great afternoon and they're discussing Shakespeare and everything is so wonderful. And then right after she writes, how much we have to fear is terrible to think of. Mm-hmm. Because the happiness can't be separated from this fear of what's coming next. And so she wrote that she had, and this is when I go like this, it's great, determined never again to allow myself the enjoyment of any affection beyond the bounds of moderation. Mm-hmm. So she's going to try to constrain her love so that she can wall out that dread, that fear. So these two challenges, the fear that love meant loss, and this desire for moments to herself. Keep these in mind, right, as we go along and see what happens next. All right, so we've moved through some years, and now we're in 1798, which was a terrible year for the Setons. Nothing against the year as a year, but for the Setons, it was a terrible year. And the background is that William and William's father, like many businessmen then and now, used debt to finance their operations. But at this point, the debts were growing out of control. There's a little letter from William's father, and he's written it on a day that, as he puts it, a financially pressed sea captain coolly blew his brains out. And William writes that it is tough and tough. Our portion, or sort of our debt, for this month of June makes my hair stand. And the father, mind you, the father-in-law is a much more confident merchant than Elizabeth's own husband, William. And William really relied on his father to have the nerve to keep the enterprise going. And then one winter day, you Chicagoans will know more about than Arizona weaklings such as myself. But it's an icy day. He steps out on his porch and he falls. And I think that he must have broken his hip. Because he takes to his bed, and there are this period where they hope that he will get better, but he's not getting better. And Elizabeth knows, again, she's entirely clear-sighted, and she knows that it's her father-in-law more than her husband who is the tent pole, right, of this business operation. And so she knew what lay ahead when, weeks after this simple fall on the porch, the father-in-law died. But it was slightly worse than she imagined. Because it turned out that despite the weeks of decline and all those years of complicated transactions, the elder William Seton had never made out a will. And so this added a layer of complication. And he'd never made his son privy to all of his decisions because his son really didn't responsibility to all of those decisions. But everything now was in William's hands. And there was another issue, which was that William had 8 younger half-brothers and sisters. They were all orphaned now, and they were all the responsibility of William and Elizabeth. Elizabeth, who was still in her 20s. So they had to leave their snug little house on Wall Street behind and take over their father-in-law's home. And Elizabeth, who loved time to herself, she writes that at every moment I hear a half-dozen voices calling sister or mama. Sometimes she thought that she would never have a moment to herself again. Of 2 of the older children, she observed, girls of 12 and 14 are much more difficult to manage than at any other time in life. Fact check, true. And she also just has to kind of buck up her husband, right? Because William absolutely tries to keep trading. You can see in the newspapers from the time that he's struggling to piece together cargoes and keep the business afloat. But he's fragile. He's fragile in every way. And Elizabeth writes to a friend, "My Seton is in a distress of mind scarcely to be imagined." And to another, "You know Willie's disposition. Sometimes he says it will work out, at others nothing but prison and poverty." And so she's keeping his spirits afloat. She's caring for all these children, and it's a struggle against her own nature. And she writes to her closest friend, wonderful friend named Julia Scott, "To be sure, for me who so dearly loves quiet and a small family, to become all at once the mother of 6 additional children and the head of so large a number is a very great change. Death or bread and water would be a happy prospect when I consider self." This is her internal struggle, but she keeps going, right? Elizabeth Seton just always keeps going. She carried on. She found good schools for the children, older children. She taught the younger ones along with her own herself. She not only kept William's spirits up, but love and action worked informally as his assistant and accountant for weeks, and sometimes kind of in extreme conditions. She wrote, "For one entire week, we wrote till 1 and 2 in the morning." And she would take on this burden while heavily pregnant also. But none of this could stave off fate. So William's business failed. A ship loaded with, of all things, gold, sank. And no one would accept his promises to pay. So his business just kind of shudders to a halt. It's frozen without that ability. William declared bankruptcy, and it was a blessing that they could declare bankruptcy, because this is 1800, and there had just been a bankruptcy law passed. Otherwise, he would have ended up in debtor's prison. As when he fears prison, he literally fears prison, which has no set end term, right, for when you're released. But he declares bankruptcy, and Elizabeth has to write up an inventory of everything they owned for the court. And you can see this inventory in the archive: linens, shirts, spoons, books, everything just exposed to public view. What a shocking change of fortune for her. William's already fragile health breaks entirely. And the couple, along with their oldest daughter, Anna Maria, who at 8 was already her mother's very close companion, made a desperate voyage to Italy. And they hoped that a family for whom William had worked years earlier, the Felici, might help him recover from bankruptcy and that the climate might restore him. But they were quarantined on arrival in a cold stone building lashed by waves. And just days after they were released, William died. And Elizabeth had felt she might not survive his death. She had, it turns out, not been able to love her husband carefully within the bounds of moderation. And so she felt tremendous pain. And yet again, she kept on. That's what she does. And it was during those days in Italy, right after William's death, and in the company of her grief-stricken little daughter, who has just watched her father sicken unto death in close quarters, that Elizabeth fell in love with the Catholic faith, with the way it offered God's presence in the Eucharist, with the culture of saints, with the figure of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who she was particularly moved by, and who her Protestant kind of church in New York had not offered to her really in a meaningful way. And with the way, in short, that heaven seemed to touch earth through the beauty of art and the saints, and through gestures like the sign of the cross, which she had not been familiar with. So there's a whole wonderful, long, complicated story about the conversion, which I will just set over here, because it's not kind of directly related to our theme, but it goes on for months, and it's really interesting. So I'll sort of sail us back across the Atlantic to Manhattan, and then I'll sail us through a bunch of months of uncertainty and pick up again on the other side after Elizabeth has formally become a Catholic. Okay? So you're wondering when that happened, right? It took a while, didn't it? So she became a Catholic in the first years of the 19th century at a time when many Americans, including in her own family, thought Catholicism was a religion of the past. Maybe okay for the old world, right, with its hierarchies and its superstitions, but not suited for a new nation that needed independent thinkers and patriots. Kind of the traditional Anglo-American mistrust of Catholicism. Most of Elizabeth's family did not demand that she change her mind about her choice of faith, though they didn't like it. But they did ask her to hold her tongue. They did not want her to share her new faith beyond her own children. That was kind of the compromise that they wanted. And at this moment, Elizabeth felt she could not agree to those terms. She believed at that moment that Catholic belief was essential to salvation. And it's clear from the archive that she kind of feels like, the rules of a dinner party do not apply when salvation is on the line, right? She, as a philosopher might say, she has a prime directive. And she's honor bound to pursue it. So she only reluctantly obeyed a priest's instructions not to proselytize children attending a school in which she hoped to teach. And she made sure people knew that she was only reluctantly not proselytizing, which was kind of hilariously inappropriate for the time. She's sort of destined to upset people around her. And she also shared Catholic teachings with young girls in the family. Although not her own children, but sort of young girls in the family, although the other adults in her family did not want her to, and reminded her that they were supporting her, right? That they were supporting her. She was the widow of a bankrupt husband. She owed them, kind of. It's clear that this sort of merchant family expects compromise and expects her to uphold her part of this implicit contract by keeping her faith private. And this is where those little notes that I mentioned, that's where they come from. It's when she is quietly, pretty much secretly, sharing Catholic teachings and encouraging these girls who are eager for it, right? She's in no way forcing it on them. They are very eager to learn. And you can also tell they're kind of thrilled at how secret this is. There's not much that's in the control of a young girl in 1805. But at that moment, the most important decision in the world, right? What do you believe? Was in their control. And they wanted to follow Elizabeth. And, they don't have any addresses on them because they weren't sent through the post. They were left in, dead drops, like you'd leave a spy document. would pick them up. So it's really quite dramatic. And at that moment then, Elizabeth felt that active love required sharing the specific teachings of her faith. The secret notes were in the end discovered, as probably secret notes usually are. It comes out that some of this world has been going on, and her angry relatives make Elizabeth feel unwelcome. Absolutely, there is true family conflict at this point. But you know, she really already wanted to leave New York. She had really, in her mind, decided that after appreciating all the possibilities of New York and all this difference for so long, she didn't want that anymore. She wanted to live like a fully Catholic life. She wanted it to surround her in a way that she felt she had seen in Italy. And so she understood that in a way her family did understand her. They did understand how serious she was about this, and that she couldn't fit into this genteel world of compromise anymore. So she ends up, now we're sort of marching along again. I get carried away and then I have to speed up. So she ends up, she first wants to go to French Canada, right? Because that just seemed more Catholic. That proves fairly impossible. So instead, a clergyman named William DePaul and others encouraged her to go to Maryland, where the country's largest Catholic community was. And so she goes to Baltimore. It's another trip on another boat, another transition, and then she's in Baltimore. And she's very grateful for this new start. She lives literally within the sound of the bells of St. Mary's Seminar, so her days are kind of marked by that rhythm, which she loves. She has all of her children gathered around her. Again, they had been separated. But soon, when you think about it, kind of amazingly soon, she was restless again. Because this was the life of a school teacher. This is a beautiful life, but Baltimore wasn't different enough from New York. She didn't feel as if she was living this life of devotion and worship and service that she longed for. And clergy around her also felt that she could be more useful to the fledgling Catholic Church than she was. And the fact that she was a mother, a widow, a former Protestant, all of that was kind of good because it made her more acceptable to Protestants who might have tended to mistrust Catholics, right? Or think that they were alien or a nun, right? Was some entirely different creature. This was a very nice lady from New York. And the Sulpician priest, the French priest, very clearly saw that she could be an important figure in growing in American Catholicism amidst this mistrust, if given the opportunity. So it's at this point that she works with Sulpician priests and with John Carroll, who was the first bishop and then the first archbishop of the American Catholic Church, to create the religious community that would become the American Sisters of Charity, and that eventually led to so many other congregations, right, in the Federation that we know today. And it drew for its ethos and regulations on the Vincentian tradition, and specifically the French Daughters of Charity, becoming an apostolic community of women who took annual vows and lived lives of worship and service to others. And when the Maryland community was officially constituted, Sulpician priest Jean Dubois translated Vincent de Paul's words into English. The American sisters would have no cloister, but public streets, hospital rooms, no enclosure but obedience, no grate but the fear of God, no veil but that of holy modesty. It's a very direct adaptation of that tradition. But that translation lay in the future when Elizabeth set off from Baltimore to what was then a remote part of Maryland, actually still a fairly remote part of Maryland. Don't try to call an Uber in Emmitsburg. And as she got to Emmitsburg, she thought, it's clear she thought that she was entering a completely new life, right? That she had reached the end of the journey, the culmination of the journey, and she was now Mother Seton. And she was immediately miserable and struggling. And one thing you see in the archives is what you don't see. And you don't see letters in these early weeks to some of the people she was closest to, because she could not tell a happy story, right? And she also didn't want to lie to them. So there's this kind of silence. as she wondered how she would create a sisterhood in this rough countryside alongside a priest, Jean Dubois, who seemed to her all practicality and business, all bustle. And she struggled to exert her own judgment on which she had relied, right, throughout this difficult life. How to exert that judgment within the framework of apostolic life. This was a struggle. She wanted guidance, not from Dubourg, who was the designated superior, or even from Dubois, but rather from a priest she found more kindred, an ebullient, I think slightly off-kilter Sulpician named Pierre Babad. He loved the feast days, he loved the gestures, he had this kind of richly cultural sense of Catholicism that was more akin to her own feeling than Dubois was, but he had no official role in the community. And in the end, she, her unhappiness is fairly clear. Dubourg steps aside. It's agreed that he will step aside from being superior, and another priest, John David, is appointed. And Elizabeth is horror-struck. She had not imagined that this would be the consequence. And she writes apologizing and asking for another chance for Dubourg to continue as superior. And this felt like repentance. It was repentance to her, but you can see how it also might look. She's refused to accept this superior, and now she's refusing to accept he's not her superior. And so another priest, Father Mugot, writes to her and calls her impertinent. And I imagine Elizabeth gasping as she reads this. He's making clear he does not feel that she's living within her vow of obedience. And so she has, she has worked so hard, and she does. She obeys, she accepts the new superior, she cuts off communication with Father Babad. But the new superior was not a kindred spirit either. He thought, for example, that really only the religious instruction mattered at the school that Elizabeth and the sisters had founded in Emmitsburg, whereas Elizabeth believed that intellectual education was important also. And I think most difficult is Father David's just kind of tone of confident surveillance. So his letters are sprinkled with, "Take care, dear mother, you would do well to. Let also the sisters of St. Joseph remember." It's nothing all rude about it, but it's a kind of, a modern person might say, micromanaging, a kind of hovering. That was difficult, difficult. And Elizabeth wrote eventually to Archbishop Carroll, "Really I have endeavored to do everything in my power to bend myself to meet the appointed superior in every way, but the heart is closed." And so there were other challenges too, because this is again a life where she's always hearing people calling her, right? We're living in a drafty stone house. There's a lot of women. It's a life of devotion, but it's not a life of quiet contemplation. It can't be. It's a life of active service and a life very much in community. And that challenged her, right? This woman who had always loved time to herself. And there were other kind of smaller challenges. One sister, Rose White, just seemed to Elizabeth to settle in more easily than she herself had. And Father David, I think, made very clear that Rose White was his favorite. And the only thing worse than losing that kind of competition was feeling that one was competing at all, right? This was not why Elizabeth Seton had gone to Emmitsburg. What was to engage in this. And so to her horror, I think she felt herself out of place in her own home, just as she had done when she was a child. And that she was not to be child but mother, and that she hadn't been thrust into this situation, but she had chosen it. She moved heaven and earth to achieve it, just made it more acute. And so she was absolutely suffering. And when I first wrote this sort of up, right, sort of wrote through what was happening, I went back and I read it, and I realized that I had drafted a story of kind of despair, of all kinds of things going wrong. And it was very incomplete. It was incomplete enough so that my story was bad history. Because there are all kinds of other documents from this time as well. Receipts for groceries that she signed, these charming certificates of good behavior for children, evidence that sisters are coming and they're feeling loved and seen by her, right? The children are feeling loved and seen by her. And so it's the daily work, right, that is going on, that is conducted according to the rhythm of the rule and the regulations and amidst the beauty of this Maryland countryside. That's the way that Elizabeth came to be Mother Seton. And she continued to suffer periods of spiritual dryness. She continued to know, difficulty, to know tragedy. She lost children. And yet, she carries on, and her life becomes richer, more beautiful, more serene by the month. You can just see it going on. And the work went on too. The sisters fairly quickly developed missions in Philadelphia and New York. And both of those, by the way, are led by Sister Rose White, whose sort of bustle and ability to run things could be difficult in Emmitsburg, but was perfect in these missions. And Elizabeth was grateful for Rose's success and happy for her. So Mother Seton and the sisters had not waited until everything was figured out, until their relations with each other were settled, until their prayer lives were uniformly rich, before they taught the children and made the beds and found the cheapest cuts of meat to buy so that they could feed the orphan children more effectively. And so I think that the first part of Mother Seton's life, the demands of her friends and family, the sense of not quite fitting in, even those tedious nights doing accounts for her husband, all of that had not been separate from her life as Mother Seton, but it was really the ground from which her new life grew, and the ground in which her holiness was always rooted. So she continued to hear voices calling for her, to feel hands reaching for her, to need every element, really, of her strength, and to recall the many moments of her own life, which were filled with unhappiness or disorientation, as she learned to live in community and with others. The last thing I'll note is that she did decide that work, that sort of living the life of Catholicism, of worship, was more effective than proselytizing in sharing her faith. That is kind of what she defaulted to. She continued to believe that Catholicism was the safe path to salvation, but she no longer tried to argue others into that. She lived in such a way that she exemplified her faith. And good offices, she spoke about good offices, which meant specific loving attention to others. Nothing abstract about the benevolence of Mother Seton. And so she makes clear, I think, something I've learned, that we're obligated to see and listen to each human being, even if children are crying and ships are sinking, because they usually are. Even if the person is difficult or alien in some way, because we usually are. And the woman who had once feared loving too much because it brought loss, wrote, "Fear nothing so much as not to love enough." So I'll end on that note, and I hope that this little talk has offered some sense of my own gratitude for the relationships that this work and the Vincentians and scholars have offered me, and some sense of the work of love in Elizabeth Seton's life. Thank you. Now you can ask questions, right? Yes.
What made you interested in her? Why did you choose to write about her?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had kind of two separate parts of my existence. I've been brought up Catholic, I always loved saint stories, and I was an historian of the early Republic. But I never put two and two together. I mean, it's sort of crazy. And then I was teaching a class, I was doing a postdoc, and I was teaching a class sort of the early republic, the revolutionary era, and I asked each student to write a little biography of someone. So I was doing this in Virginia, so everybody's like, George Washington, and other Virginians, because that's how Virginians are. And then, and it's good that they're that way. And then one young woman said, I would like to write about Mother Seton. And I was just like, Lord, I was like, oh my goodness. Because she's born in 1774, she dies in 1821. And then I thought, well, are there any sources? Any sources. So not only are there the archival sources, but it was at this point, sort of around 2000, that the collective writings were beginning to come out. You could read through them, and you realize that, perfect for a biography, she is extraordinary, right? She's extraordinarily spiritually gifted. She creates this amazing community, but she's also ordinary. She's a wife, she's a mother, she knows financial problems. She has long friendships. She fights with her, and so that combination, kind of extraordinary and ordinary, both, made her a wonderful subject for a biography. And then, of course, you get into it and you just fall in love, right? She's just so interesting, and funny, and lively, and challenging.
Do you know when and why and by whom she was called Mother Seton?
This starts very early, right? Bishop Carroll, did he? Okay, so Sister Betty Ann, who knows all, who has politely allowed me to give this talk, but who couldn't give him this talk, says it was Bishop Carroll who first called her that. And it takes root immediately when she's in Emmitsburg, absolutely immediately.
When she made her vows, her private vows in 1809.
So he's the first.
And that was a private event.
Right, it was private.
Did it have any, legal is the wrong word, but any specific meaning apart from just a title? Or do you know?
My guess is no, in part because Bishop Carroll initially felt some unease about the fact that this woman who had never been a daughter would be a mother, right? Is how I was thinking. So she had no background in apostolic life, let alone in kind of monastic tradition. He's won over to the idea that she will do it, and he had already written, she's a saint, actually quite early. But I don't feel that he was bestowing a particular title on her, and he also, Carroll was really interesting. They're all I'm obsessed with all these people. But John Carroll was interesting. He also wanted to create a Catholicism that wouldn't offend Protestant neighbors. He was highly educated. He had a kind of interior piety model of Catholicism as well. And he emphasizes to her more the enacting of the vows than the moment, right? He's not particularly invested in public ritual. The community didn't have official standing at that point, right? It's later that it does.
Just to put it in sequence, on March 14, 1809, the Sulpicians made a decision that's documented to buy land in Emmitsburg. So the donation had come in. So that's March 14th. March 25th, she makes vows privately for 1 year to Bishop Carroll with only her daughter Catherine present. So there was the sense of women were coming and they would be in Emmitsburg. They would relocate. So the mother of many daughters concept, I think, was being lived out.
Yeah, and very consciously, she's mother with a capital M and little m mother, right? Her daughters are there with her in that community. She doesn't leave them, as she enters a convent. It's not that story. She brings her daughters up in the community. Her sons are just down the patch or up the mount at Mount St. Mary's, which is a petite seminaire at the time. So they're very present. Very present.
What miracles are attributed to her?
Yes. So, Sister Betty Ann, do you want to help out with this one? I could answer, I should say, but I like to do.
a number of miracles were, quote, suggested as possibilities, but the three official ones that were accepted was the cure from pancreatic cancer in 1935 of a daughter of charity, Sister Gertrude Porzendorfer, whom I believe was in New Orleans. And then in 1962, a little girl about 4 who had leukemia in Baltimore at St. Agnes Hospital. And the mother felt, the doctor said there was nothing else they could do, and one of our sisters said, well, would you be willing to pray to Mother Seton? And the mother signed the child out of the hospital against medical advice, drove to Emmitsburg, an hour and a half in those days. Later on the altar in the mortuary chapel where Mother Seton was then buried, the mother, whom I've spoken with, said she knew instantly that the girl was cured.
Wow.
The mother felt it, and in fact she was. That's Ann O'Neill, who's a grandmother in Baltimore, a retired beautician, stylist. And the third miracle was 1974, a patient in a man of about in his 60s in New York City. The diagnostic category is 4 words, and it was a very complicated rubella, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And he became blind, and he was cured, and he attended the canonization in 1975, as well as Ann O'Neill came to the beatification and the canonization. And
Sister Betty Ann was there as well, weren't you?
yes, I was there.
She was there.
Yeah. But I do believe that the Age of Miracles is not over, and people visit the National Shrine in Emmitsburg, and there are many reports of spiritual favors.
Is there a project to collect those reports?
Yes, there
okay.
is now.
Okay, great. Because there should be. I'm glad to hear it. There must be, yeah.
I just want to say that this was totally fascinating, and thank you. And kind of that sense of in some ways very ordinary, struggling with a lot of things, but also extraordinary. That and I think you conveyed that really well. And my wife and I were in Emmitsburg last year.
Oh, wonderful.
But you know what? We got that same sense. It was like, wow, this is so ordinary, so like every day. But then there was like something else. I got the same sense listening to you today.
I'm so pleased. She is an extraordinary person, and she's an extraordinary person who suffered in ways that ordinary people do, right? Or who rejoiced in ways that ordinary people do. So when you think about it, she's a single mother, right? She's a widow raising 5 children. She's trying to figure out how to balance a career, right? How to balance being Mother Seton as well as taking care of her children. And the sort of extraordinary kind of compassion that she developed. I mean, that is just so extraordinary. So that experiences that I think most of us would just become bitter, right, or sad, or just hide in our rooms forever. Like, I mean, she just made her more gracious, right? Seek out more connections, made her more gentle, so that pain really made her feel kind of God's mercy, and also though made her feel this beautiful sense of human community. And you can see people responding to her in those ways. I was so startled because there's this sort of young man who's irritatingly perfect, one of the Harvard boys, and his sister's just like a terror, but he's perfect, and he'll write to his grandfather, I used the Christmas money you sent to buy, food for other people or whatever. Oh my gosh. You think, what is up with this kid? I didn't trust him. Like 200 years down the line, I don't trust this guy. But he wrote, after her death, he wrote just the most beautiful tribute to her, and it was just in a letter. And he said, she was a holy person, but she didn't sort of parade it, and she didn't walk around in sackcloth and ashes. If someone needed her to be cheerful, she was cheerful. If someone needed her to sorrow, she sorrowed with them. And she just saw people and offered of herself what that person needed in that moment. So of course I had to like put the letter aside, issue a heartfelt apology to this young man 200 years. So I completely misjudged him. But yeah, it just kind of glows. It just glows off the page. Although again, it's also this labor of love of the sisters and daughters, and Seton's spiritual daughters who collected all this. Right? This is why we know this about not just this woman, but the people around her. It's because of this sort of heroic, meticulous labor of collecting and then sharing, right? Absolutely opening the archive, sharing insights, answering my really sometimes just so clueless questions, graciously, patiently, in a welcoming fashion. That's also why we can know about Mother Seton.
What's your current project?
My current
The
project.
one you love most?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I did, because I knew that I wasn't going to have an immediate new labor of love, because this had taken, I do it in kids' years, and my daughter was in kindergarten, and she's a sophomore in high school now. So I took on this very interesting, but kind of technical project of writing a narrative history of the Jesuits and the colonies in the United States, which is very enjoyable. But I'm more sort of deeply interested in original settlers in the Maryland colony and some of the women there, because that also was a really interestingly challenged Catholic community where women were adapting to a new environment, adapting to a world with indigenous people whom they hadn't even known were there. We're bringing Catholicism to life in different ways, so I think that that's my next real project. I think that's kind of you to ask. Thank you.
Catherine, I'm so glad that you brought out that Mother Seton herself was part of a blended family, as well as her husband, William McGee, part of a blended family. But could you, because I think that's very contemporary, could you comment, or do you recall, did she ever make any comments about American parents?
Yes, so as an instructor who sometimes gives people things other than A+, I particularly appreciated this. So she is running a school as part of the community, and she says that American parents basically expect their children to do well. They don't take criticism of their children kindly, and this was kind of a burden for her to bear as a school teacher. And so there are many useful things that I try to have running through my head from Elizabeth Seton's life, but yes. And I should say she also, she loved specifically and she criticized specifically as well, but through love. So there's this Father Hickey, right, who is this sort of very young priest who's just kind of newly ordained and figuring things out. And he appears to have asked her, like, why do people do what you tell them? They don't do what I tell them. It's clear that he has intuited that he does not have the effect on the young people that she does. And she says, you have to tune the criticism to the key of their heart. So you don't simply tell everyone they're wonderful. You don't give everyone a trophy at that moment, but you see people, you encourage them to grow into the best version of themselves, and you do that accepting who they are and just seeing who they are, right? And instead of having sort of an ideal model and trying to fit that. Yeah, but she was capable of sharp judgments, gentled by compassion, but very insightful judgments nonetheless. Thank you. I think I've taken up enough of your time, right? You have this glowing clock at the back of your room, which I'm very conscious of, but thank you.
So thank you very much for visiting us.